Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. And as discussed on the season opener, we're going to mix it up a little bit. And frankly, this episode this week was not intended to be, I was going to show something different. I was going to do something different. But then some things happened. So this will be a shorter episode, but it's going to cover a little more of an in-depth look at what's going on with Israel and the recent events. So we'll just jump right in. As always, you can follow me on Instagram and YouTube, Fighter Pilot Professor, or get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. All right, so unless you've been hiding under a rock, you will know that this happened this week, or this past week, I guess, as you're listening to this. And then this happened. And then, and not to be outdone, this happened. And so this prompted me to say, I feel like we need to talk about this, right? So we're going to focus just in on what's going on with Israel, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, and we'll talk a little bit about Mossad and kind of how this operation went down, right? So just backing up to get some context going on here, right? So let's talk first about Lebanon. So this is where all of these attacks took place, was in Lebanon. So Lebanon, like a lot of things in the Middle East, as I've said many times here, is complicated. It's complicated. It has a rich but complex history, right? Civilization in Lebanon is one of the oldest in the world. And Beirut and some of the other cities in Lebanon are some of the oldest cities in the world as well. Now, going all the way back to biblical times, right? There were people living here. They have a wide variety of ethnic mix, of religious beliefs, etc., right? But sort of flash forward, much like Israel, Jordan, and other nations in the Middle East, the modern state of Lebanon went through a series of invasions, right? So the Greeks and the Romans, the Muslim caliphates, then in the 1500s, it fell under the Ottoman Empire, and that lasted for 400 years, basically. It was under the control of the Ottoman Empire through various sub-caliphates, etc. And then in World War I happened. And as I've said before, again, if you want to know why some things are the way that they are, you can usually blame the British and or World War I. And in this case, it's not the British. Well, it's kind of the British. It's the British and the French, right? So Lebanon fell under the French mandate at the end of World War I after the Entente divided up the former Ottoman territories as a result of the ending of World War I. And the French got a hold of parts of the Middle East. The British got a hold of other parts of the Middle East, and one of the parts that the French got a hold of was Lebanon. And in the modern day state, what is the modern day state of Lebanon, was essentially, the boundaries were essentially drawn by the French. And then in 1944, the French turned loose the state of Lebanon to an independent state. And this is going to be the important part here. This is where we get into the parts that you got to listen to, right? Up to this point, obviously, the French had been ruling the nation remotely, as it were, right, through colonial power. And now the French divided the new Lebanese government essentially between the three main factions of religious sects contained within the country of Lebanon. So an important thing to know about it is Lebanon, like I said, has a rich and diverse history, and therefore it comes with a very sizable population of most of the major religions, monotheistic religions from the Middle East. So Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Christians, and Jews, all in some percentage make up part of Lebanon, the Lebanese population. When France turned the government, the Lebanese over to their own independent government, they divided the government in between three parts: a Christian part, a Sunni part, and a Shia part. And that stayed that way largely with a reasonable amount of conflict until the 1970s. Interestingly, during the Arab-Israeli conflicts after Israel was born, and then 1967 and then 1973, Lebanon did not participate in those wars. And so Israel and Lebanon have a mixed but complex relationship, and the part that comes next is why they have this mixed and complex relationship. The main part that they have this mixed and complex relationship is because beginning in the 1970s, Lebanon fell into a civil war that basically lasted until 1990 between the ruling factions. The government divided into three, couldn't really get along, and it descended into violence. The violence was widespread, internal killings between these various religious sects. Famously, the U.S. Embassy was bombed. Several U.S. service members were killed, and these sort of things were sort of common in especially 1980s Beirut and Lebanon in general. And then 1979, the Iranian Revolution happened, and the Iranians took advantage of the sort of lawlessness of Lebanon and began to inject their power via what would eventually become Hezbollah. Hezbollah wrote their first manifesto in, I think, 1985. They became a known organization in the mid 1980s, let's say. And their sole purpose, they are Iranian-supported terrorist organization whose sole purpose in the world is to wipe Israel off the map and kick Westerners out of the Middle East. And so that's their mission, and they've been after it pretty much since the 1980s. The problem is that both in southern Lebanon, so as we see on the map here is Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, sort of the southern part of Lebanon, southeastern Lebanon, southwestern Syria, northern Israel, what is now part of the Golan Heights. That part of the world was effectively ungoverned because of the conflict in Lebanon, issues ongoing in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel itself, all of these things having, sort of leaving this area semi-lawless. It's pretty remote. It's fairly mountainous. And Hezbollah took advantage of that. And they have been a part of that sort of, as you say, government in a government in that part of the world. And they move back and forth reasonably freely between Lebanon and Syria and getting support from the Iranian government. Lebanon has also received support from Syria and Iran. So it's this very complex relationship. And so much so that Hezbollah became part of the Syrian government in, I think, 2005. That may be wrong, but somewhere in the mid-2000s. And so since then, it's been a very, tense relationship. And as we saw this past week, the embedded nature of Hezbollah within Lebanese society and in Syria is obviously pretty deep. So the three things that happened were bombings of the explosion, I should say, not bombings, but explosions of pagers, of walkie-talkies, and then eventually an airstrike on the part of the Israeli Air Force. The first two operations, obviously, Israel has not claimed responsibility for, but largely acknowledged that the Israeli Mossad, which is the Israeli sort of CIA translation, their special organization, spies, covert operations, all of these things are part of what they do. And obviously, depending on which news source you're reading right now, and the facts are wild and varied at this point, right? But this is a deep, long-term operation done by likely the Israelis to get after the Hezbollah people in Lebanon. And frankly, I think this is originally the Hezbollah undertook the use of pagers and walkie-talkies to get off the grid, as it were, right? To quit using smartphones and dumb down their technology to make it more difficult for their leadership and foot soldiers to be tracked. But obviously, Israelis, it seems, have been playing a long game to get into the manufacturing cycle, to get these things into circulation, and specifically in the hands of Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon and in Syria. And so I think, from a strategic perspective, this should be frightening to Hezbollah and anybody that operates like Hezbollah does, knowing that just how deeply the Israelis, Mossad presumably, are within their organization, right? It also creates a lot of long-term strategic problems in the region, which we'll go into more, but these will be obviously unfolding. Then, we also saw the airstrike on Hezbollah leadership by the Israeli Air Force. And these sort of airstrikes happen, I hate to say frequently, but I'm going to say frequently, semi-frequently. The Israelis do not hesitate to attack what they perceive as threats, particularly in southern Syria and in southern Lebanon, in these border sort of wild controlled territories, or sort of uncontrolled territories, or territories that are controlled by Hezbollah. So I think that we'll probably see more of this. Unfortunately, we'll also probably see responses from at least Hezbollah. Hamas has their own problems, although those two organizations are loosely linked through the Palestinian Liberation Organization and through Iranian money. I don't know that at this point in their life, Hamas really has the strength to do anything in cooperation. So it'll be interesting to see how and if Hezbollah responds. My guess is usually they respond to things like this through rocket attacks, mortar attacks, and occasionally kidnapping or attacking Israeli soldiers along the border. So we'll likely see some of that. Will be interesting to see if the Iranians actually respond to this as well, or maybe the Syrians. It will be complex. I can tell you that. This just went from a sort of serious situation to, in my opinion, a very serious situation. And the complexity of it went deep. And I think this sort of finally, the reason why it's so complex is because the depth of Hezbollah within the Lebanese government, the depth of Iranian influence within the Lebanese government and within Hezbollah, and we're going to see effects both within the Iranian organization and within this Lebanese government organization, and all of this is going to be tied directly to the attacks that the Israelis carried out trying to target Hezbollah operatives. So more to follow, obviously. We'll see what happens. As always, keep shooting me your questions. Like and follow on Instagram or on YouTube at The Fighter Pilot Professor. Hope you have a good one.